Good morning, everyone. I am Kenneth A. Gregorio from the Midterm Group, and I will present you the third topic from the midterm period, which is the documenting disparities, the cause and effect, and the evolution of a field. So, these are the contents that we are about to discuss today. So, the first one is the cause and effect and the evolution of a field. Second is the theoretical explanations of environmental inequality. Third is the globalization. Fourth is the EJ or the environmental justice and healthy environments. And the last one is climate change and environmental justice issue. So these are the topics that we're about to discuss today. So the first one is the cause and effect and the evolution of a field. So EJ or the environmental justice has often been posed as which came first, the chicken or egg problem. So in other words, was the hazard cited in a community dominated by a poor and minority group, or did the poor move into the neighborhood of a hazardous site because real estate was cheaper? So this question gets to causality. What was the cause of the environmental inequality? One approach to studying a spatial geographic phenomenon such as environmental injustice is to begin an inquiry by mapping the phenomena and then attempt to explain the observed patterns over time. Mapping is only a first step in explaining why patterns exist, however. By hypothesizing causal relationships between observed patterns and then testing these hypotheses, some possible causes or explanatory factors can be accepted and others ruled out. Determining the causes behind the patterns can often be difficult and then even controversial, so EJ or the environmental justice is no exception. Behind tracing the evolution of the field of EJ research provides an illustrative example of how researchers use data analysis in an attempt to prove a point or verify a hypothesis. It also highlights the importance of constructive critique in the research process. So, the next one is, as noted in 1994 by Bulliard concluded that the geographic distribution of both minorities and the poor is highly correlated to the distribution of major hazards, including air pollution, municipal landfills and incinerators, abandoned toxic waste dumps, leading poisoning in children, and then contaminated fish consumption. Bulliard also argued that virtually all studies of exposure to outdoor air pollution have found significant differences in exposure by income and race. So finally, he found that race more strongly correlated with these hazards than class. In contrast to Bulliard's conclusions, Heyman in 1996, for example, in subsequent research found no universal explanation for the siting of hazardous sites across time and space. He and others have argued that the empirical evidence for environmental discrimination remains mixed. So the ambiguity largely results from five factors or key issues. So the first one is the proper scale of analysis or areal unit chosen, like for example the county versus the census tract. And the second one is the characterization of the risk. The third one is the affected population for subgroup. The fourth one is the uncertainty over the intentionality of the siting decisions. And the last one is the time frame of the study. So, the most common problem or point of contention concerns issues of scale. Many studies have found that the results of studies tend to be function of the scale to analysis. Characterizing risks also proven difficult, especially where urban pollutants are concerned. For example, simple relationships of proximity do not account for prevailing wind patterns that disperse pollutants. Moreover, for the case of pollutants such as particulates, long-term studies of the health effects were required before a direct link could be made between a hazard and human health. Only as researchers have closed the links between an emission source, wind patterns, and the health impacts have studies of the impacts of particulates proved conclusive. So, all industrialized societies have created hazardous conditions for their own citizens. And it should be clear that even in a relatively homogeneous society like Japan, class and cultural behaviors created constraints for the voice of activists. Determining the intentionality of citing decisions is perhaps the most difficult issue to untangle. The selection of subpopulations for study is also important. Although most environmental justice focus on race and or income, a study by Greenberg in 1993 found the factor explaining the inequity rather, was not race or wealth, but age. Accordingly, a disproportionate number of the facilities were located in areas with a high percentage of elderly residents. So, EJ examples are not only about race or ethnicity, and these examples, together with the Minamata example, which clearly complicate and straight and simple stories about discrimination based on race alone. However, the critical review served the important purpose of influencing researchers by pushing them or directing them to address key gaps and weaknesses in the research. As a result, the more recent environmental justice research is better um, and stronger. Most importantly, the evidence produced tends to support the general argument that environmental justice scholars and activists have made for decades. Long-term studies of hazardous sites help to uncover the dynamics of change. Since Bulliard's landmark publication in 1994, numerous studies have attempted to test his hypothesis of systematic racial prejudice in terms of hazard siting in the US context. There have also been a number of critical reviews of the body of EJ research. The language in these reviews is sometimes overly harsh, perhaps due to the political charge aspects of EJ. However, the critical reviews serve the important purpose of influencing researchers by pushing them and directing them to address key gaps and weaknesses in the research. As a result, the more recent EJ is better and stronger. Most importantly, the evidence produced tends to support the general argument that the EJ scholars and activists have made for decades. One of the more convincing responses was by Mohai and Saha in 2007. According to these authors, one of whom was criticized by Bowen for weak science, researchers have focused on improving two types of studies over the past decade. First is the pollution dispersion assessments, and the second is the site proximity assessments. Pollution dispersion assessment studies involve collecting data about the volumes and toxicities of various air and water emissions, the timing of emission releases, and other key factors such as wind. From this data, estimates are made about the geographic dispersion and disposition of the toxic emissions. Census data are then employed to determine the demographic characteristics of those most likely to live where pollution and toxicity levels are concentrated. A few pollution dispersion studies have gone as far as attempting to conduct risk assessments in which human exposure and expected lifetime cancer risks are estimated. So, by far, the most frequently employed approach for conducting quantitative environmental inequality analysis has been to assess the proximity of hazardous sites to nearby populations, perhaps because this does not require sophisticated modeling of dispersion. As such, nearly all national level environmental inequality studies have involved proximity assessments. These studies have been very influential in spurring policy, development, and further research in the area of EJ. Although most have found these disparities to be statistically significant, there has been considerable variation in the magnitude of racial socioeconomic disparities found. For example, a few studies has even found that there were no race and income disparities associated with the presence of environmentally hazardous sites and locally unwanted land issues. Mohai and Sana in 2007 hypothesized that a likely source of the variation in findings has been wide reliance in environmental inequality research on what has been termed unit hazard coincidence methodology. So this approach involves selecting a predefined geographic unit, such as the zip code areas or census tracts, to determine which subset of the units is coincident with the hazard and which subsets are not, and then comparing the demographic characteristics of the two sets. So the authors point out that the two assumptions are implicit in this approach. First is the adverse impacts tend to be concentrated within close proximity of the hazards, and the second is the populations living within the host units are located closer to the hazard under investigation than populations living in the non-host units. So we are now heading to the theoretical explanations of environmental inequality. So a variety of explanations have found offered as to why environmental inequalities exist. So the factors hypothesized to account for the racial and socioeconomic disparities in the distribution of environmental hazards tend to fall into three categories, which are the economic, the sociopolitical, and the racial. First is the economic factors. Economic factors include industries' desire to minimize production costs by locating new facilities in places where land values and operation costs are low. These places may be coincidentally be where low-income people and minorities live. Alternatively, the facilities once cited may cause a decline in property values and the quality of life, motivating affluent people to move away and the poor and the people of color to move in because of increased affordability of housing. The second is the sociopolitical factors, which involve imbalances in social capital and political power among communities. Disproportionate citing of hazards may occur because of poor, minority communities have fewer resources to mobilize and less access to decision makers than do affluent white communities that would enable them to effectively lobby to keep out unwanted land uses. So even without intent by government and industry to do so, NIMBYism may be better to organize, and more powerful, predominantly wealthier communities may lead by default to disproportionate placement of unwanted land uses in minority neighborhoods. The third one is the racial factors. These involve locating hazards in minority neighborhoods is intentional, even though it may be difficult to find a smoking gun or prejudicial attitudes behind siting decisions. Deliberate targeting of new facilities may occur because minority communities over time have come to be recognized as the paths or least resistance by government and industry. So even if minority communities are not intentionally targeted for society's unwanted land uses, race may still play a role in environmental inequality because housing segregation may limit the ability of people of color to move away from such sites. Right? So there has long been special interest within the EJ movement for understanding whether racial disparities are largely a function of socioeconomic disparities, whether other factors associated with race are also related to the distribution of environmental hazards, but all three factors intermix and overlap. So, for example, racial inequality in education, employment, healthcare, land use planning, and other societal domains can limit the social and political capital of communities of people of color to prevent the siting of the polluting facilities and subsequent undesirable neighborhood change. So, not everyone agrees that hazardous waste disposal companies and public officials in the United States deliberately targeted African Americans, indigenous tribes, or other minority communities for problematic development. While some observers argue that a hazard such as toxic waste dump would bring jobs to an impoverished community, others argue either that class has influenced hazardous waste siting decisions more than race, or that poor and minority communities move into areas around pre-existing industries. Climate change can potentially have negative impacts on disadvantaged groups in two ways. First is the disadvantage. People are likely to suffer more from the consequences of climate change, such as extreme weather events. So, think of how Hurricane Katrina caused greater damage and negative impacts in the poorer African American communities of New Orleans, for example. So, the second is the policies designated to mitigate climate change and produce a more sustainable society may adversely impact disadvantaged groups. So now we will be heading to globalization. As globalization has resulted in an increase in the production, distribution, and dumping of environmental hazards, the EJ movement has taken on an increasingly international dimensions. As noted above, Hollander in 2004 argues that poorer societies often choose to accept pollution as a trade-off for industrial and economic development. His main point is that only once a society has achieved a certain level of prosperity can it turn to environmental concerns. There are at least two critics of Hollander's view. However, the first is that there is no guarantee that a country will achieve economic development by accepting more polluting industries. The second is that while environmental policies in developed countries tend to produce cleaner environments in those countries, they also had to shift the most toxic industries offshore. As such, it's not all clear that increasing while producing an overall improvement in the environment. Rather, economic development tends to shift dirty industries somewhere elsewhere. In 2006, tons of poisonous chemical sludge were dumped at various sites around the port of city of Abidjan in the Ivory Coast, leading to thousands of reports of people suffering from vomiting, diarrhea, and nosebleeds. Investigations traced the dumping to a tanker registered in Panama that had been chartered by a Dutch-based oil trader, as a variety of newspapers reported on the complicated story. So this incident resulted in several environmental groups decrying the lack of proper controls over the international waste recycling market. As waste management has been globalized, countries with civilian unrest, no environmental law enforcement, or weak legislative frameworks have become prime targets for illegitimate hazardous waste dealers. Now we will be heading to the EJ, or the Environmental Justice and the Healthy Environments. As the description of Long Beach, California in the introduction to this chapter illustrates, environmental injustices can take multiple forms. While the bulk of EJ research and activism has examined environmental hazards by focusing attention on the needs of disenfranchised populations, a recent shift has placed more emphasis on environmental amenities such as parks, green spaces, and the built urban environment in general. Disparities in the built environment can be identified in at least 5 arenas: housing, transportation, food, green spaces, and squalor. So, the location of green spaces such as parks in Long Beach tends to be disproportionately proximate to the wealthier and whiter population of the city. Parks and green spaces represent critically important environmental amenities because contact with nature is highly valued and offers a range of health benefits. So, in cities and towns, parks are the principal venue for regular public access to nature. Parks also offer settings for physical activity and social interaction. So, moreover, when it comes to transportation, it is another area where EJ scholars and activists are beginning to work. According to Fromkin in 2005, equity concerns in transportation take at least two forms. First is the certain elements of transportation infrastructure, such as highways and bus depots, are locally undesirable land uses. Poor people and people of color live disproportionately near these two locations and suffer associated health consequences. The effects of diesel air, pollution, noise, injury risks, and ugliness. So, Transportation systems that do not necessarily provide poor people with convenient, practical assessment to employment, medical care, and other necessities and undermine their health in numerous ways. So, more recently, there have been an increasing recognition that the built environment may affect what people eat. So, in poor neighborhoods where members of minority groups disproportionately live, junk food and soda and cigarettes are readily available in small markets. So, is climate change an environmental justice issue? Climate change is surely one of the greatest environmental challenges of our generation, but is it also an AJ issue? According to climate justice scholars, climate change touches on two main ethical concerns. The first is that global warming will likely hurt the poorest and least able to adapt to a changing environment. For example, people living in low-lying areas such as the Pacific Islands or coastal Bangladesh, which will likely be flooded. The second ethical issue is that efforts to curb carbon emissions and slow global warming will fail unless all parties involved feel that they are being treated justly. So, others, however, argue that climate change is an environmental justice issue of another sort. Climate justice scholars argue that some populations will suffer disproportionately from policies designed to counter climate change rather. In general, climate justice research focuses on the disproportionate impacts of climate change and climate policies. So these are the three basic assertions of climate justice. First is the climate change and the policies to address climate change will have numerous economic and social consequences. Some have called this a problem of double exposure, in that some societies will be faced with a squeeze from both biophysical changes or the climate and at the same time the pressures of economic globalization, and that is according to Leichenko and O'Brien in 2008. The second basic assertion is that the impacts of both climate change and related policies will not be felt uniformly by all members of society. Some groups may face more severe and adverse effects than others. The third is the low-income groups and people of color will likely face more severe impacts than other groups from climate change and related policies. So, a primary goal of the climate justice movement is to ensure that no racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic group bears a disproportionate share of the negative consequences of climate change and related policies. Climate justice advocates seek to protect vulnerable communities from the impacts of climate change and to implement policies that provide a just transition. Climate justice also places great emphasis on community participation in state decision making, research, and policy development. So, a final aspect of climate justice is to document the extent to which the major economic and health costs of climate change will be disproportionately borne by low-income communities and people of color. So, to summarize all our learnings for today, let me read this quote. Be a part of the solution, not part of the pollution. So, if you have any questions, feel free to comment it down. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.